A boot slammed down on the wet diner floor and sent a metal bucket flying clear across the room. Gray water splashed up the wall and across the counter. A woman on her knees flinched back, her wet rag still clutched in one hand. A man towered over her, red in the face, screaming that she had missed a spot. He grabbed her by the collar and yanked her halfway up off the floor. Her knees skidded hard on the tile. She didn't scream. She didn't fight back. She just turned her head toward a booth in the corner, where a small boy sat very still, watching his mother get shaken. Her name was Rosa Delgado. She had $11 to her name and a hungry little son. What that little boy did next made a room full of hells. Angels go completely silent. Stay with me on this one. Rosa had been scrubbing floors at the Blue Star Diner, just off the highway outside Barstow, for 7 months. 7 months of the same thing. She showed up before the sun came up. She wiped the tables, filled the ketchup bottles, mopped the bathrooms, and hauled the trash out back where the heat came off the asphalt in waves. She worked until her hands cracked. And every Friday, when it came time to get paid, the owner had a new reason why she wouldn't be getting all of it. The owner was a heavyset man named Cal Hutchins. Cal had inherited the diner from his father and run it into the ground, and somewhere along the way he decided the reason his life wasn't better was everybody around him. He took it out on the people who couldn't fight back. And Rosa, well, Rosa couldn't fight back at all. She had come north with nothing. No paper she could use. No family close enough to help. Just a 2-year-old boy named Mateo and a suitcase held shut with a belt. Cal knew all of it. That was the whole reason he hired her. A woman with no options works cheap, and she doesn't complain, and if you decide to keep half her wages 1 week, what is she going to do? Call the police. She wasn't going to call anybody. Cal understood that the way a spider understands a web. So he paid her when he felt like it. He'd hand her a folded stack of bills that was always short, and when she counted it in front of him, careful, quiet, he'd sneer and ask if she was calling him a thief. Here's the thing about a man like Cal. He didn't just want the free labor. He wanted her to feel small while she gave it to him. He'd do it in front of the truckers at the counter. You see this one, he'd say, jerking a thumb at her. Dumb as a post. Can't even mop straight. I keep her around out of charity. And the men would laugh, some of them, and Rosa would keep her eyes on the floor and keep moving. She had a way of surviving it. She'd learned to go somewhere else in her head, while her hands kept working. She thought about her mother's kitchen 1,000 miles south, the smell of it, the way nobody there had ever once made her feel like garbage. She held that place in her mind and she scrubbed, and she waited for the day to end. That was her whole life now. Endure the day. Get the boy fed. Wake up and do it again. The only good thing about that diner was the corner booth. Rosa couldn't afford a sitter, so Mateo came to work with her. He was a quiet boy with big dark eyes, and he'd sit in that booth for hours with a single toy truck and never make a sound. He knew, the way even little children know, that being loud got Mama in trouble. So he stayed small and quiet, and he watched everything. That morning, Mateo hadn't eaten. Rosa had $11, and rent was due, and $11 was the whole distance between them and the street. So breakfast had been one saltine cracker split down the middle. She'd given the boy his half and kept hers in her apron pocket, telling herself she'd eat it later. She never ate it later. She never had the chance. Around noon, the noise started. It came in low first, a rumble you felt in your chest before you heard it in your ears. Then it filled the whole parking lot. 20 engines, 30, and the truckers at the counter turned on their stools to look. A line of motorcycles rolled in off the highway and parked in a long row out front. Chrome and black leather and dust. The men who climbed off those bikes were big and weathered and slow-moving, the way men are when they've stopped needing to prove anything to anybody. On the backs of their vests was a patch every person in that diner recognized. The truckers went quiet. Cal, behind the register, stood up a little straighter and put on the greasy smile he saved for people he was scared of. At the front of them walked the biggest one. He had a gray beard down to his chest, a thick neck and hands like bricks. His name was Deacon Malloy, but nobody had called him Deacon in 30 years. They called him Bear. He was the president of that chapter, and he had a face carved out of hard years, and when he walked into the Blue Star diner the whole room seemed to lean back to make space for him. He didn't look at anybody. He just took the big corner table near the booth, and his men filled in around him, and Cal came scurrying over with menus and that smile. Rosa kept her head down and kept working. Bikers meant a big table, a big mess, and if she was lucky, a tip Cal wouldn't be able to steal because they'd hand it to her directly. She didn't look at them. Men like that, in her experience, were just another kind of storm to wait out. You didn't stare at a storm. You kept your head down and you let it pass over you, and you were grateful when it was gone. What she didn't see was her son sliding out of the booth. Mateo had been watching the big man with the gray beard for a while. He'd never seen anyone that size. And Mateo had exactly 3 words of English in his whole small vocabulary. 3 words his mother said to him every single morning when she split their food and held out his half. He got down off the seat. He walked across the floor on his unsteady little legs, right past the men who could have snapped him in two, and he stopped at Bear Malloy's knee. Then he reached up and tugged on the bottom of that leather vest with one hand. In the other hand, held up as high as his arm would go, was half of a broken saltine cracker. "Open your mouth," Mateo said. The whole table went still. Bear looked down. This toddler, this tiny thing in a shirt 2 sizes too big, was holding up half a cracker like it was the most valuable thing in the world. And to Mateo it was. It was breakfast. It was the thing his mother gave him with love when there was nothing else to give. And he was offering it to a stranger. "Open your mouth," the boy said again, patient, insistent, pushing the cracker toward Bear's beard. Nobody at that table said a word. These were men who'd been to prison. Men who'd buried friends. Men the whole state was afraid of. And every one of them was staring at a 2-year-old, holding out half a cracker to their president. Bear Malloy didn't move for a long moment. Then this enormous man, slow and careful, slid off the bench and got down on one knee on that greasy floor so his face was level with the boy's. Up close you could see something working behind his eyes, something none of his men had seen in a long, long time. And he opened his mouth. Mateo, very seriously, placed the half cracker on Bear's tongue. Bear ate it. He chewed that dry little cracker like it was the finest thing he'd been served in years, and his eyes never left the boy's face. "Thank you," he said, and his gravel voice cracked right down the middle on the second word. "Thank you, little man." That's when Cal came around the counter. Cal had seen the boy leave the booth. He'd seen him bother the customers, and in Cal's mind, bothering the customers was Rosa's fault, and Rosa's fault meant Rosa was going to hear about it. He crossed the floor fast, wiping his hands on his apron, that fake smile gone. "Hey, hey, get your kid away from my customers." He grabbed Rosa by the arm as she rushed to collect Mateo, and he yanked her sideways, hard, the same way he'd yanked her that morning. "What did I tell you about the brat running loose? You want to lose this job. Is that it?" I'm sorry," Rosa said, reaching for her son. "You're worthless." Cal spat, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "You know that. I feed you out of charity, and this is what I get. Take that kid and get out. You're done. You hear me? Get your stuff and get out of my diner." He shoved her. Not hard enough to knock her down, but hard enough. She stumbled, caught Mateo up in her arms, and the boy started to cry, that silent, turning loud cry of a child who knows he did something wrong but doesn't understand what. And Bear Malley, still down on one knee, watched the whole thing. Cal turned back to his fancy customers with a shrug and a chuckle, the kind of chuckle that says, "Can you believe I have to deal with people like that? Sorry about that, gentlemen. Some folks you just can't teach. What can I get you? Coffee's on the house." Bear stood up. He didn't say anything. He looked at Rosa, who was gathering her thin coat and her son's toy truck with shaking hands over by the booth, tears running down her face, whispering to Mateo that it was okay. It was okay, don't cry. Then he looked at Cal. Then he reached into his vest, pulled out a worn leather wallet, and set some bills on the table. "We'll take the check," Bear said. Cal blinked. He'd expected trouble, maybe, and instead the scary biker was just paying and leaving. Relief spread across his fat face. Sure thing, boss. You come back any time." Bear and his men filed out. The engines fired up one by one, that rumble filling the lot again, and then they pulled onto the highway and were gone, and the dust settled, and the diner was quiet. Cal let out a breath and laughed to himself. "See," he said to the truckers. "All bark." He looked over at Rosa, who was standing by the door now with Mateo on her hip and her suitcase of a purse over her shoulder, and he waved a dismissive hand. "You still here? I said get out. Go on. And don't come back looking for a reference." Rosa opened the door and walked out into the heat with her son and nothing else, and the little bell over the door jingled behind her, and that was that. It was over. Everybody thought it was over. It wasn't over. It hadn't even started. Rosa made it about 100 yards down the shoulder of the highway before she heard it again. The rumble. Coming back. She turned around, and the whole line of motorcycles was rolling back into the Blue Star lot, and Bear Malley was in front, and this time he did not park politely at the edge. This time the bikes fanned out and stopped right across the entrance, 30 of them, engines idling, blocking the whole front of the building. Bear swung his leg off, and he didn't head for a table. He walked straight to Rosa on the shoulder of the road. Here's the thing you have to understand about a man like Bear Maui. He grew up hungry. Not a little hungry. He grew up the kind of hungry where you steal bread, and you learn which church basements hand out soup, and which ones ask questions first. His mother was gone by the time he was 5. His father was a fist and a bottle and not much else. He learned early that the world was divided into people who had and people who didn't, and that the people who had spent an awful lot of their time reminding the people who didn't exactly where they stood. And there was one thing Bear had learned crawling up out of all that, one law he lived by harder than any club rule. You never, ever forget who was kind to you when you had nothing. And you never forget who was cruel to you when you had nothing either. That little boy had just handed him half of everything he had. "Ma'am," Bear said to Rosa, and his voice was gentle now, careful, like he was talking to a spooked animal. "I'd like you to come back inside with me. Just for a few minutes. I promise you, on my life, nothing bad is going to happen to you or your boy. But there's something that needs setting right, and it needs you there to see it done." Rosa held Mateo tighter. She'd learned a long time ago not to trust men who made promises. Every man who'd ever made her a promise had used it to take something. But there was something in that ruined old face. Something that had cracked open when her son put a cracker on his tongue. So she nodded slowly, and she walked back. "And listen. If you're still with me this far, if this story's got its hooks in you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Because what Bear Maui did inside that diner is the part people in Barstow still talk about to this day." When Bear pushed the door open and walked back in with Rosa and the baby behind him and 30 bikers behind her, Cal's smile fell off his face and shattered on the floor. "We're closed." Cal tried. "I mean, we're full up. Kitchen's backed up." "Sit down, Cal," Bear said. Cal sat down. He sat right down in the nearest booth like his legs had been cut out from under him. Bear pulled a chair around and sat across from him, slow, folding those brick hands on the table. "I heard you call this woman worthless," he said. "In front of your whole diner. I heard you say you feed her out of charity." He tilted his head. "How much you pay her, Cal?" Cal's mouth opened and closed. That's between me and my employee. That's private business." "How much?" One of Bear's men, a wiry older guy they called Preacher, stepped up beside the booth. Preacher had a way of just standing that made people nervous. "Answer the man," Preacher said quietly. Cal's story fell apart fast, the way lies do when somebody actually pushes on them. It came out in pieces. "He paid her," he said, "fair wages," he said. And then Bear asked Rosa in that same gentle voice how much she'd actually taken home, and Rosa, quiet, told the truth. She told them about the folded stacks that were always short, about the weeks he skipped entirely, and told her she owed him for letting the boy sit in the booth. About the charges he invented for a broken glass, for a dropped plate, for being 2 minutes late when the bus didn't come. 7 months of work. She'd been paid maybe a third of what she was owed, and even that came with insults stacked on top like it was a favor. Her voice never rose. That was the thing that got them. She didn't sound angry. She sounded like somebody reading a grocery list, like this was just the shape of the world and always had been. And the calmer she stayed, the harder those bikers' faces got. The diner was dead silent. The truckers at the counter weren't laughing now. One of them, an old-timer named Ray who'd watched Cal chip away at Rosa for months and never said a word, was staring down into his coffee, ashamed of his own silence. Bear listened to all of it. He didn't get loud. That's the thing people always get wrong about men like him. The dangerous ones don't get loud. He just got very, very calm, and the calmer he got, the more Cal sweated. Here's how this is going to go, Bear said. First thing, you're going to figure out, right now on paper, exactly what you owe this woman for 7 months of honest work at a fair wage. Not your wage. A real one. And then you're going to pay it. All of it. Today. In cash, out of that register, out of that safe in the back, out of your own pocket if it comes to that. I don't have that kind of. Cal started. You've got a Cadillac in the lot. Bear said. You've got a house on the hill. You've got it. He leaned forward an inch. You've got it, Cal. There was a second development that came right on the heels of the first, and it was the one that turned Cal's face from red to white. Because Preacher had been standing there quietly, and now he set a folded piece of paper on the table. See, the club had been in that county a long time. They knew people. They knew the man who held the note on the Blue Star Diner, because Cal, it turned out, was behind on it. Badly behind. He'd been skimming from his own business to feed a habit at the card tables in the next town over, and he'd borrowed against the diner from a man who was, as it happened, an old friend of the club's. We had a nice talk with your lender on the way back here. Bear said. Turns out he's tired of chasing you. Turns out he's happy to sell that note to us for what you already owe on it. So as of about 20 minutes ago. Bear tapped the folded paper. We hold the paper on this place. Which means I'm going to guess we're just about your landlord now, Cal. And your bank. And your patience is about used up. This is the part that stunned everyone. Cal looked at that paper, and he looked at the 30 men filling his diner, and he looked at the woman he'd shoved out the door 20 minutes ago, and the whole thing finally landed on him at once. He wasn't dealing with a bully bigger than himself. That he could have understood. That was just the world he lived in, big fish eating little fish. What he couldn't understand, what broke something in him, was that these men, these terrifying men, had come back for a maid. For a nobody. For a woman he'd been stepping on so long, he'd stopped seeing her as a person at all. Why? Cal whispered. Why do you even care? She's just. Say the next word careful. Preacher said. Cal didn't say the next word. Bear stood up. He walked over to where Rosa stood by the counter with Mateo, and once again this huge man got down slow until he was at the boy's level. Mateo, not scared anymore, reached out and patted Bear's beard with one small hand. And Bear Malloy, president of the chapter, a man the whole state was afraid of, started to cry. Not quiet either. His shoulders shook. Tears ran down into that gray beard, and he didn't wipe them away, and he didn't turn from the room. He took the boy's little hand in his enormous one, and he held it, And he cried like something 40 years old and locked up tight had finally come loose. When I was about your boy's age, Bear said, his voice thick, talking to Rosa but loud enough for the whole silent room to hear. I stood in a soup line in the cold, and a man came down that line handing out bread. And when he got to me, he looked at me, this dirty little kid, and he decided I wasn't worth the loaf. Said it out loud. Said I just wasted. Passed me right by. He drew a ragged breath. I told myself that day I'd get big enough that no man would ever look at me like that again. And I did. I got big. I got hard. I made the whole world step around me. He shook his head slowly. But you don't ever really get big enough to stop being that kid in the cold. You just learn to hide him. I have eaten a lot of meals since then, ma'am. Some of them in fine places. And not one of them, not one, ever tasted like something somebody gave me because they wanted to. Not until your boy walked across that floor and put half his breakfast on my tongue. He looked up at her, this wrecked, weeping mountain of a man. He gave me half of everything he had. And he did it because you taught him to. In a place where the man who owned it taught him he was worthless. Bear shook his head again. No. No, ma'am. That account is getting settled today. He stood back up, and he wiped his face with the back of his hand, and when he turned around he wasn't crying anymore. He was done crying. Now he was just president. Cal paid. It took 2 hours. Bear made him open the register and count it out on the counter, and it wasn't enough. So Bear made him open the safe in the back, and that got most of the way there. And for the rest, Bear sent him out to the Cadillac for the cash Cal kept in the glove box for the card tables. He counted it all into Rosa's hands, bill by bill, in front of everybody. Every dollar of 7 months of work, at a wage a decent man would have paid, with the insults refunded at no charge. But Bear wasn't finished. Because holding the paper on that diner turned out to mean something. Now here's the thing, Bear told Cal, folding that note back into his vest. You've got 2 choices. You can hand over the keys to this place right now and walk out to your Cadillac and drive off to whatever town will still have you, and we'll call your debt square. Clean slate. You never come back to Barstow. He let that sit. Or you can fight me on it, and I'll call in that note tomorrow morning, and you'll lose the diner, the house, the car, and probably your teeth, and you'll still owe. Your pick. Cal picked the keys. Of course he did. He set them on the counter with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, and he didn't say another word to anyone. He walked out to that Cadillac and he drove off toward the highway, and the last anybody in that town ever saw of Cal Hutchins was his tail lights heading east into the heat. The diner was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet now. Bear picked up the keys off the counter, and he turned them over in his big hand, and then he held them out to Rosa. She stared at them. I don't understand. Place is paid off as far as anybody's concerned. Bear said. Club's got no use for a diner in Barstow. But a woman who'll split her last cracker to feed her boy, and teach that boy to share it with a stranger. He pressed the keys into her palm and closed her fingers over them. That's a woman I'd trust to run an honest kitchen. It's yours, Rosa. Deed and all. We'll see the papers get done right. No strings. No debt. Yours. Ray, the old trucker, stood up from his stool then. He came over and put a folded 20 on the counter, more than his coffee cost, and he looked Rosa in the eye. I should have said something, he told her. Months ago. I'm sorry I didn't. And one by one, the men at that counter did the same, dropping bills, mumbling apologies, and it wasn't the money. It was that, for the first time in 7 months, somebody in that room was looking at Rosa Delgado like she was a person. Rosa couldn't speak. She held the keys in one hand and her son in the other arm, and she cried. And Bear reached out and steadied her shoulder with a hand that could have crushed stone. You don't owe me anything, he said, before she could try to thank him. You already paid. That boy paid. You just didn't know the price was that high to some of us. The Blue Star Diner opened again 2 weeks later under Rosa's name, and the whole town came out to see it. It's a strange thing how fast a story travels in a small place. Everybody had heard some version of it, the maid and the toddler and the biker who wept in the booth, and half of them came just to see if it was true. They stayed because the food was good, and because Rosa, for the first time in her life, was standing behind her own counter instead of kneeling in front of somebody else's. She hired old Ray's niece as a waitress. She hired a cook. She put a high chair in the corner booth, Mateo's booth, and that booth was never for sale to any customer, no matter how full the place got. That was his. She kept the name Blue Star, but she painted the sign herself, and under the name she added 3 small words in careful letters. Open your mouth. Nobody who didn't know the story ever understood it. Everybody who did know, it went quiet when they read it. The angels came back through Barstow every few months, and when they did, the whole chapter filled that diner, and there was never a check. Rosa wouldn't hear of it, and Bear stopped arguing about it after the first time, because he understood what it meant to her to be able to give something now. That was the whole point, wasn't it? A person who has been given something needs, someday, to be able to give it back. To anybody. That's how the thing keeps moving. Mateo grew up in that diner. He grew up tall, as it turned out, and he grew up steady, and he grew up knowing exactly one story about the day he was 2 years old, because his mother told it to him every year on his birthday. How he walked across a greasy floor on wobbly legs and offered half a cracker to the biggest, hardest man in the room. How that man got down on one knee and opened his mouth. He didn't remember doing it. But he carried it anyway, the way you carry the important things, the ones that happened before you were old enough to hold onto them yourself. Bear Mao came to that boy's high school graduation years later. Sat in the back in his leathers, gray beard down to his chest, and when Mateo's name was called he stood up and clapped with those brick hands harder than any father in that gymnasium. Afterward, out in the parking lot, Mateo, near grown now, walked over to the old man he'd known his whole life. And Bear reached into his vest, slow and careful the way he did everything, and he pulled out something wrapped in a scrap of clean cloth. He unfolded it. Inside was half a saltine cracker, gone hard and pale as bone, kept all those years. You gave me this, Bear said. A long time ago. I never did eat that second half. Figured I'd hold on to it. Figured a man ought to keep one thing to remind him he was worth feeding. His old eyes shone. Turns out I kept it long enough to hand it back to you. So you'd know it too. The story started with a woman on her knees on a wet floor, being told she was worthless while her son watched. It ended with that same son, grown and standing tall, holding half a cracker a hard old man had carried for 18 years to prove that a kindness never really gets spent. It just changes hands. And that floor, that greasy diner floor where it all began, it was hers now. Every tile of it. She scrubbed it herself some mornings before the sun came up, the way she always had. Only now, when she got up off her knees, there was nobody in the world who could tell her she didn't own the ground she was standing on. That's the thing about a debt of kindness. The cruel ones think the small people will never collect. And every once in a great while, somebody comes along who never forgets. Who keeps the receipt? Who rides back into the lot when everybody thought it was over and settles the whole account at once. Rosa Delgado kept that diner for 30 years. And she never once, not one single time, sent a hungry child away from her door.